started last week. And when he gave me a brief, he said, what you've got to do is read the book, read what it says, but you mustn't use the study material. So thanks a lot. When I came last week, I didn't know what it was I was going to speak about because I felt I needed to hear what Mark said. And as I was listening to Mark, I felt God gave me this parable. And then I went out thinking, well, really, what has that got to do with the subject of the book? So I was divering a bit, but I felt, no, God's given me this. In the afternoon, we went to Swindon to visit a friend, and we went to see some friends there, a Christian group there, and the first person who stood up, and they read this parable. So I thought, God, you've given me this. So, what a wonderful story, and I do love stories, and the way Jesus tells this. Can you imagine it, that the king, he says, do you know what, I've got to put my accounts in order, let's see who owes me what. And this servant is brought to him, and this servant owes a lot of money. Can I borrow your bag a moment? In one version it says that this servant owed 10,000 bags of gold. 10,000 bags of gold. Imagine if I couldn't hold it, could I? But I own that. That's about the only gold that I own. And even that's most probably worth 50 quid, I don't know. But 10,000 bags of gold, thank you. And he had to pay it. He owed it. And then he fell to his knees and he said, please have mercy on me, have mercy on me. And the king was touched and he forgave him. He said, okay, debt's cleared, out you go, get on with your life. What amazing thing to be forgiven for. But what did the servant do? He went outside and he saw somebody who owed him in old money 10 bob. If you're old enough, you know what I mean, 50 pence. And he took hold of this person and he shook him and he said, you owe me 50 pence, pay it now. And he said, I can't, please forgive me. And no, to jail, go to jail, and do not return and do not come back unless you pass go or whatever it was. And we know what happened. And the other servants reported him and said what had happened. And the king was very, very cross. And so, when we think about the topic, which is God's goodness, why did God give me that parable? And I think, first of all, it's for us to realize about God's goodness, because what was the first servant owing? He was owing 10,000 bags of gold. I mean, if you try and imagine the worth of that, and what Jesus was saying is, for us, that's what we owe God. That is what we owe God. And we have to think about that. What does that mean? I want you to, could you put that first slide up, please, Elaine? Because as we often do when we watch television, they show us, don't they, in last week's exciting episode. Who likes that? Do you like seeing that? No? But they always show you in last week's exciting episode. So in last week's exciting episode, this is where Mark finished, and he showed us this circle, and what he was saying is, God's so good to us, so remember that and put it into practice. The exact opposite of this parable that we've looked at today. We who have been forgiven so much should then go out and put that into practice. And what does that mean? Well, Mark explained what that means. God's good to us. We've got to be good to others. And he talked about different ways that we could do that. Okay, thank you, Elaine. So I want us to think a little bit, though, just what that means. Now, if you were living at the time of Jesus and you was Jewish, you would be under the Old Testament law. And that was quite a hard law. Could we have the next slide up, please, Elaine? So here's a little diagram, and you can see there's 5 different things there There's one, the burnt offering, and that was voluntary, it says. Second was the meal offering, that was voluntary. And then there was the peace offering. So all of those things you could give to God. But then there was two things that weren't voluntary. Number 4, the sin offering. Because you are sinners, because we are sinners, we had to do certain things. And if you read in Leviticus, it tells us what those things would have been. And then there's number 5, the trespass offering. Again, we sin, we trespass, we do wrong things. So, for if you was a Jewish person living at the time of Jesus, time after time after time, you had to go and you had to do these things just to try and be right with God. Okay, thank you, Elaine. And we can read about this in the book of Hebrews, because if you turn to Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 10, chapter 10 and verse 10, it says that you can't read, Paul. Just one moment, sorry. It said, and by that will we have been made holy through the sacrifice of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Because in those old times, day after day, every priest stands and performs his religious duties. Again and again, he offers the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when the priest has offered for all time one sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, and since that time he waits for his enemies to be made a footstool. And so there, the person who wrote to the Hebrews is saying that what they used to have to do with the law, where they had to bring sacrifices time and time again to the priest, and the priest had to say things, say prayers, say supplications to God for the person, then that was an ongoing process. But the person who wrote to the Hebrews said, no, when Jesus did what he did, what we thought about a couple of weeks ago when it was Easter, he did that once for all. No longer do you have to go through all of that ritual. And that is the 10,000 bags of gold. That, for each one of us, is what we don't have to do anymore, because Jesus has paid the price. It was interesting in your testimony, you mentioned about the sheep, the one sheep. Well, Jesus tells 3 parables altogether in Luke 15. There's the parable of the lost sheep, and the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the lost son, or the prodigal son. And all of those parables he tells because he's saying, this is how much God loves you. This is how much he wants to take those 10,000 bags, which represents your owing God, your sin. This is how much he wants to take them off you. He cares for you, each one of you. And as Joy shared, that was true for her, but that's true for us, each one of us. And if you've come here this morning and you think, well, I'm not sure if that's for me, please don't leave today. If you think that you haven't yet accepted that Jesus did that for you as an individual, please talk to somebody. Come and talk to one of the leaders here, talk to me, anybody, and they will tell you the truth of that. Jesus wants you. But there is a warning in that parable, and while we're thinking of God's goodness, and it's amazing that what Jesus did on the cross is like paying that 10,000 bags of gold, the warning is that, as we looked at the diagram that Mark told us, that puts us under a responsibility. We're like that first servant. We've been forgiven so much. How can we then not forgive others? And yet, it can be very, very difficult, can't it? And we've all known it. I'm sure we've all known it when we sort of say, well, yeah, I kind of forgive them, but I'm not going to talk to them anymore. And if I see them coming down the street, I'm going to cross over and I'll avoid them. Have we then truly forgiven? And thinking about that, there's a challenge for each of us that if you know that there's somebody you haven't yet fully forgiven, that you're still very uneasy with them, then there's a challenge there to do something about it, because our God is a forgiving God. I mean, when you look at the parable, it ends up that in the end, we can be punished if we don't forgive. But it started with how many times? And it says not 7, 70 times 7. So we've got lots and lots of time over the years that we have, that if we're holding someone in for unforgiveness, we've got lots of times to do it. It's quite interesting when you read that story, because if you read just before that, Jesus is giving some teaching about the church, which is rather weird because at the time the church didn't exist. And yet, when you read in Matthew 18, before Peter comes and asks him the question, he's been telling people how discipline within a church should work. And it's important there is discipline, because discipline can do away with unforgiveness, because if we deal with things properly, things don't get to that state, because there is a whole set of ways that we need to talk to people, and if that's not accepted, we take witnesses, etc., etc. Read that. But when you read the story, Peter was prompted by that to go to Jesus. And it's interesting when you read it, I don't know Peter's motivation. Was he doing it out of curiosity, or was he doing it because he was being provocative? But he went to him and says, okay, you've said we've got to forgive how many times? And it's interesting, he said, up to 7, and Jesus says, no, 70 times 7. In other words, there is no end to how much we have to forgive. And the reason is, and then he told the parable, because you've been forgiven so much. God has been so good to you. How can you not be good to others? And there's the challenge. Now, there's always got to be, that's a practical, when somebody's teaching, there's always got to be a practical outcome. And first of all, as I've said, if you know that there's someone you haven't fully forgiven, there's a challenge this morning. God would say, well, do something about that. But it's also, I think there's a prophecy for us as a church. It's amazing that when Mark came, the first thing that he concentrated on was mission. That's saying that this church is going to grow. God wants to grow this church, and we're seeing that already, but that's only the start. If we're serious about mission, this church will grow. Now, the problem with growing churches is that people come into the church and they're often not the kind of people we would choose to have come into the church. We know this. How do we know this? Because Jesus, who was the founder of the church, what did he get criticised for? He got criticised because the religious leaders at the time said, well, how can you say that you are who you are? Because look at who you mix with. You're in Wetherspoons. You're in Wetherspoons with the kind of people, no, it doesn't say that, does it? But it says you go to the pub and you meet with prostitutes and tax collectors and the lowest of the low. Now, if we're serious about mission, God is going to bring people in who we perhaps are going to find very difficult. Their ways of life aren't going to be our ways of life. The way they speak, the way they act might be offensive to us. And there's a warning. God's given us a warning, because if we start to feel, oh, we don't want that kind of people, then we have to remember we've been forgiven 10,000 bags of gold, how can we not forgive somebody who only owes a few coppers? Now, that's not to say we've got to accept the behaviour, and as a church, I hope that we'll carry on teaching the truth, which we do. People can hear God's truth and they can change, but it's often a slow process. And so, whilst we've got to be challenged to forgive if we're holding someone in unforgiveness, I think we've also got to be challenged that as we grow, as God answers our prayers for mission, the people who come, we've got to be loving, we've got to be forgiving, and we've got to be, as that diagram that Mark showed us, we've been forgiven, we've got to forgive and show God's love. And so I feel that was why I was given that message. I hope that that's encouraged us, and I hope that as a people we will be known, and this is the beacon where Elaine talked about the beacon. We will be known as people who love and accept because we are loved and accepted. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. We're going to sing now. Here is Love, Vast as the Ocean. You'd like to stand? Please sit down. I think the children should come in a minute and